This is a session on testing new waters offshore. We have been in fact, since yesterday, we have seen we have been slightly exploring the potential of offshore. And so here, digging deeper is wind power future in deep waters. With that, we have our eminent speakers joining us. Let me first invite our moderator, Mr. Atin Jain, the Senior Associate, BloombergNEF. We have our speakers, Mr. K. Balaraman, Director General, National Institute of Wind Energy, Mr. Alastair Dutton, Chair, Global Offshore Task Force, Global Wind Energy Council. He's going to be joining us virtually. Mr. Markus Kösters, Head of Business Development, New Markets, RWE Renewables. Mr. Niels Steenberg, Executive General Manager for Offshore Asia Pacific, Seimens Gamesa, again virtually joining us. Dr. Prabir Scientist D, Ministry of New and Renewable Energy, and Mr. Bernhard Telgmann, the President Technology, Suzlon Energy. So India is still, as we've been talking about, enormous potential of exploring and exploiting the offshore wind, but of date, India has no offshore wind project. That is where we've also been talking about. We need to look into learning a lot from the experts, the global experts, and we are glad that in this session we have our global experts, people who have already set their foot in the offshore space are going to be talking to us. With that, I hand over to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, organizers. So my name is Atin Jain, and I work for a company called BloombergNEF. Now, BloombergNEF is a strategic research provider for global commodities, as well as disruptive technologies which enable the low-carbon economy. And I would like to kickstart the offshore session today by first setting some context for the global offshore wind market. Can I have the slides? Right. So in this chart, you can see, that the global offshore wind markets are actually growing at a record pace. And the pace of installations will continue over the next 15 years. We expect the market volumes to go up to about 400 gigawatt of cumulative capacity by 2035. Governments in established markets are raising their installation targets and conducting new auctions. Also, the governments in the emerging markets are busy setting up goals for offshore wind and, and providing enabling legislation to do that. It has been a busy past 12 months for the offshore wind auctions. Now, RWE won the 1 gigawatt Thor tender in Denmark very recently. The Germany had actually held its first tender under the new centralized framework for about 958 megawatt of capacity. We've seen auctions in New Jersey as well, and which awarded about 2.7 gigawatt of capacity to the bidders. And that was actually the largest offshore wind procurement in the US till date. All of the auctions that we have seen in the recent times have been successful in actually bringing down the cost of offshore wind in their respective markets. While the offshore wind markets flourish elsewhere, India is actually yet to see its offshore wind journey begin. We are still waiting for the first tender for the offshore wind. It's been about 1,477 days since the expression of interest for the 1 gigawatt offshore wind tender was put out. And we are still, the expression of interest saw a lot of interest from companies. There were 34 consortiums who were interested by it. But the long delay that we have seen has been some sort of a disappointment to those 34 companies and also the industry as a whole. The long delay also highlights some of the risks that offshore wind industry generally sees. Now, there are some risks like the technology or lease management, or even access to capital, which is easy or manageable. But then there are risks like permitting or stakeholder management, which is very difficult to manage sometimes. In India, whenever you talk about offshore wind, people are more interested in talking about the cost. but less interested in talking about risks. So I actually thought of putting up another chart which actually shows how the global offshore wind markets evolve and how the trajectory on costs come down. My clicker isn't working. Can we have the next slide? Right. So globally, what we have seen is that most markets start out at a high cost initially, but as things progress, as policy stabilizes, and as companies get more experienced, these costs start to come down. Most markets are at a different stages on this experience curve that you see. You have Europe clearly leading the way and is way ahead of all the other markets. But countries like China, US, and Taiwan are also slowly catching up. India, on the other hand, is actually at the very beginning of this curve, and we have a lot of journey ahead. With this background, I now move to the panel discussion, and I want to jump in straight to Mr. Dash, and want to talk to you about the motivations for offshore wind in India. So my question actually is, what is the biggest motivation for the government to actually promote offshore wind in the country?
Okay, thank you so much, Atin. I'm PK Das, working in MNRE for the last 5 years on wind, including offshore wind. And in fact, one of the motivation you have already said during setting the context, that in globally it is the fastest growing renewable energy and the costs are coming down exponentially. So same will be true, in fact, more true for India, because we have that experience of always, bringing down the cost to an unexpected level, which, I mean, many of the markets even cannot think. They will wonder how this is possible. So this will also be true for offshore. But now coming specific to what is the motivation for India to go for offshore, there are many reasons. But one reason certainly is, Honorable Prime Minister's commitment in this recent COP that we will achieve 500 gigawatt by 2030. And I don't see without offshore we will do it. So in wind, although we have huge potential of 695 gigawatt, and everybody knows because all are associated with the wind industry, these potential is concentrated in 7 states. So in this bidding regime, normally, because of the least cost, projects are again concentrated in 1 or 2 states, which are actually maybe struggling to support in terms of logistic support or right of way, land, grid. So all these issues are already coming. So that is why we see, although we have tendered out 20 gigawatt and awarded more than 14, 15 gigawatt, so 9 and 10 gigawatts still under implementation. Even several extensions have been given because of these issues. So that means implementation issues are already we are facing in this regime. And secondly, if you see the tariff for onshore wind, which is around 2.77 or I can say 2.8 rupees per unit, this is a kind of tariff you can achieve only when you have a CUF more than 32%. So out of that 695 gigawatt of potential what NEWE has estimated for India, if you filter out, I mean those potential areas where the CUF is more than 32 or 35, you will end up with somewhere around 60 gigawatt only. And again, you have to filter out the areas where wind projects are already commissioned and where that geographical constraints are there for onshore wind. So we will end up with only 70 gigawatt. And secondly, as for the CES optimal capacity addition report, 140 gigawatt is to be achieved by 2030. And I can admit that for the last 2-3 years, the onshore commissioning is very low. But still, we are aiming at 7 to 8 gigawatt of capacity for the next 8 to 9 years. That means we will end up with 90 gigawatt. So that means rest 30 gigawatt has to come from offshore wind.
Right, so mainly around the targets and the capacity constraints that we have on onshore, there's a motivation to move offshore. I'll actually now want to jump into Mr. Alastair Dutton, who's joined us virtually. Do you have anything to add to these motivations? Like what should be a motivation for a country like India to go offshore?
Very much. So I'm here from GWEC. GWEC is the Global Wind Energy Council and represents the industry as a whole. To add to the points that Dr. Dash has made, I would add the economic benefits of adopting offshore wind. And this is what other countries around the world have recognized. Not only is it a natural, national, inexhaustible resource, but it brings with it more industry. So typically there are twice as many jobs per megawatt in offshore wind than there are in onshore wind. And of course, more recently, we've got this issue of energy security. It's a national resource which can be added to the mix to give the diversity of energy supplies.
Right. And now that I have you, why don't you also talk us about how have the different offshore wind markets globally evolved? And do you see any parallels of offshore wind in India with any other particular market?
Yeah, I mean, it all started in Denmark in 1991 with the first project, and then the UK picked up the topic because it saw it as an industrial opportunity, not just energy supply. And Germany came in quickly behind with the Netherlands and Belgium, and collectively that created a regional market. We're seeing the same things happen. I mean, China is now the biggest market, huge deployment last year, with Taiwan coming in as well. And around Asia, we're seeing also Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, Philippines. Yeah, India needs to be next. The difference is it's a bit further from other markets. So it's going to have to do a lot more of the heavy lifting itself. The other market nearby, of course, is Sri Lanka, but India would be, particularly down at Tamil Nadu, the place to start.
Okay, moving to Bernhard, you now, you also have seen development of offshore wind markets for decades across countries and across companies. What are some mistakes that you would say point out for that other countries have made, and how can India really avoid those mistakes?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, thanks for addressing this question. I think the mistakes, I turn it into opportunities or learning. When you go into a journey of offshore, which is a totally different size or enemy than onshore, you make experience, call it experience. And I think that is, one learning is, and Alastair mentioned that 91 started in Denmark, and then the more bigger ones was 2006, 2005, Burble Banks and others, which we saw on your list. Yeah. The mistakes is you have to have a plan. In Germany, it took a while. Yeah, you have to have a plan and the stakeholders lined up. But you also, from an attitude point, not fear the mistake. I think that is key in offshore. And I think the biggest opportunity India has now, they can tap on that learnings. But don't make the mistake to copy-paste, because the conditions are different. The key thing is, don't copy-paste. Find your way, and there are a lot of skills, and we will maybe tap on in the next questions, but don't copy. And we learned it from offshore. We learned it from offshore in Europe, in the US. Look at US. How many turbines? Niels, Alastair, you know correctly, 5 turbines now installed. Took us.
They have 7 now.
Yeah, 7, sorry, today. Yeah. No, but it took one. When did we start exploring US coast? 12 years ago? Yeah. So it takes.
Yep.
Italy recently launched the first wind farm, 13 years lagging. So it takes time. And to bridge this time, make a plan. And it can only be a 5 + 5 + 5 plan. Yeah? But as I said, you can tap on the experience others has made and find your way.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. I would now like to kind of like jump you to Markus. As an international investor, what do you really make of India's renewable energy targets, and particularly the ones around offshore wind?
Yes, of course. So the potential of India is undoubted. You have a vast coastline of 7,600 kilometers. You have a huge rising energy demand that can only be fulfilled by massive increase of capacity in terms of electricity generation. And you have potential, especially in the south, around the states of Tamil Nadu, that is equivalent to the North Sea. So there's no wonder the government has put out targets for offshore wind, which we deem very ambitious. And we believe, and have been in discussions with the government in the recent years, on how we can achieve those targets. How can we make those ambitious targets as realistic as possible, and what are the requirements in order to deliver those? And there's a few messages we have placed with the government, with the industry, with the supply chain that are required in order to deliver those targets. And those start from, as Bernhard pointed out, you need a plan. You need a clear roadmap that says, out of these 30 gigawatts, that's how we break it down per year. And that's what we need to do in supporting infrastructure, such as grid development, port development, and so on, to really have that plan be delivered ultimately. There is regulation that needs to be put in place. We have been discussing the support via viability gap funding that the Ministry of Finance is currently discussing. That is a prerequisite for the auctions to be launched, and there's many more of these aspects that are requirements for these targets to be delivered. If the industry, together with the supply chain, are advising the government and are then working together to deliver the first projects as quickly as possible, this can be achieved, but we need to make this happen really fast and in a coordinated way.
You mentioned the word quickly, and I'll come to that a bit later. But now, moving on to Mr. Niels, you. As an OEM, what challenges do you foresee in the construction of offshore projects in India? Would there be some unique challenges due to India's wind resource and geography that you foresee, and how can those challenges be managed?
Yeah, I think the industry has learned to deal with a lot of different geographies and a lot of different wind conditions. Maybe the biggest challenge in India is that you don't have as much wind as the areas that we normally deal with. Which means that your capacity factors, the utilization of the equipment is simply not going to be as good as somewhere else. But a lot of the things that you have in India, high temperature, typhoons, cyclones, as you call them there, is something that the industry has learned to deal with. So actually, I think from the turbine side, we try and develop and sell a standard product all over the world. The real challenges is all the stuff that you don't see, everything that's underwater. And getting it installed, of course. There is no infrastructure in India for installing offshore wind.
Okay, so are you trying to imply that, say, a completely different class of turbines could be needed in India for say, the west coast as well as the south coast?
The south coast, as has already been mentioned, has wind conditions that are similar to what we have in the North Sea. So I think, or in the Taiwan Straits. So I think for that we are good. If you go to low wind areas, I think the judge is still out whether we will see a complete different class of turbines or whether we simply will see the scaling effect of larger turbines almost year on year, and that will compensate.
Right. Bernhard, do you have anything to add to it?
Yeah, I think I would add on Niels' comments. I think the turbine will not be the topic. I think we learned from the past, we have the instrument to design a high capacity or PLF wind turbine also for Gujarat area or Tamil Nadu. As Niels said, and Alastair, we have here by nature different conditions, but I think as an engineer, you like challenges because that creates solutions. And I think I have no larger rotor, lower rating. I think turbine is not, I can underline what Neil said, it's all under the water. Seabed conditions, yeah, and infrastructure. And looking back to 2018, when we made a lot of surveys, looking at the infrastructure here in India, what's needed for offshore, we learned. We made the assessments, and of course we put also plans in what does it cost and how to make it. And then we come to how to make it for the infrastructure to the skill sets. And I think hopefully we have time also to elaborate that, because you need arms and legs and brains to do it. It's not a copy-paste of, as I said, the European setup.
Right. Moving along, Mr. Das, coming back to you, and I will come back to you a little bit later, Mr. Balaraman. The question I have for you is, like, what were the main reasons, in your opinion, and bringing in the perspective of the ministry here, as to the failure of the 1 gigawatt expression of interest that came out in 2018?
Okay, first of all, I don't know why you are calling it a failure. I mean, I will not call it a failure at all, because here in my right side, he has already told it takes time. And the best example he has given in USA. If USA can wait for 15 years to realize 7 turbines, and blaming India for 5 years is not fair, first of all. And secondly, let me then frame my answer in this context. So in 2018, when come up with that expression of interest, it was just an expression of interest to understand the market. Okay, so based on that, in fact, we have formulated a proposal for Ministry of Finance. But unfortunately, when Minister of Finance was, in fact, repeated queries were happening between MNRE and Minister of Finance, then COVID struck. So that is somewhere we, COVID, it impacted the entire world. So we are not isolated from that. So because of COVID, maybe we are still struggling to, reframe. But now that 1 gigawatt, we are trying to scale it up to 3 gigawatt. So we'll come up with a better plan. So kind of our still that target of 30 gigawatt by 2030 still exists. So yeah, I can admit that we have could not able to reach maybe that 2022 target, but we'll come up with a better plan. And the planning is better, the execution will be better, and it is better for the market. What the input I got from the right side. Yes, I also take the note from my left side that we need to hurry, if in order to being a market leader in the entire Asia Pacific regions. So in fact, being a ministry, we are now struggling in fact to balance both the views. So these views are there from the industry to us.
Right, and I use the word failure because I think there was an industry expectation that the expression of interest is out now. Maybe in a few months' time they'll see a tender. So it was purely from that perspective. But
yeah, if I may just add on to that. Yeah, I admit there is a delay, but we have already shared our concept that discussion paper, which actually created a lot of interest and excitement from the industry again. But I can tell you, because I was there involved from the beginning, in 2018 when we are engaging with the stakeholders, at that point of time, the response was always reactive. Okay, they are very categorically say, you have to make the fast move and we will be reacting to it. But now this discussion paper, subsequent to our minister's engagement with the stakeholders, I can say there are serious players. Now they are proactive in Indian market and they are ready to invest. Okay, so this is a positive news which I can give in this forum.
Great. Moving on, Mr. Balaraman, how ready are we in terms of the pre-construction activities that are needed before we set up the wind farms? So the things like wind resource assessment, topography studies, and geology studies for the first offshore projects. Where are we right now?
See, if you try to talk about 1 gigawatt for Gujarat, so we have the wind data for last 2 years. We have the complete data available, the profile. We have done the geophysical is completed for the entire area. Geoteching has been done. Rapid EIA is done. So all the information is available. So only thing we are awaiting once who are the players who are going to be there, so we can start sharing the data with them. So because this is a MOD, there's a very clear, it cannot be on a public form. So we need to give to a particular the class of people who will be interested in doing it. So the data, everything is ready for the 1 gigawatt. So we are moving forward on that aspect of it. The wind data is made public, and everybody could access that data. For 2 years, we have the continuous measurements for 1 gigawatt. And for the remaining part of it, we are having if you see the discussion paper, we are having a model 1 and model 2 development. In the model 1, we are trying to have, because today if you talk about fixed structure for the measurements and things, it's taking a time and things. So now very shortly we are coming out of floating measurements for the wind, so floating lidars, so which is going to be started for Tamil Nadu, where we are trying to talk measurements. So that's going to come very shortly, because we put a tender, but not many the Indian players came up. Now we are going for a global part of it. So once we did, then we are going to have the wind data. At the same time, we are also trying to permit the stakeholders to do their own measurements. So that's what the model 2 is trying to talk about, where we will permit both the stakeholders to do it, and also parallel we are doing it. Once the data is available, then those projects will be connected to model 1 to move forward. So these are the kind of parallel activities being carried out, as you see in the discussion paper. And very importantly, some of the things which we used in the motivation. The important motivation for a country is the skilled manpower. We can supply to the world skilled manpower. That's the first motivation for offshore to move forward. And very important thing, and as the Alastair is talking about on the economics part of it, yeah, definitely economics is an important area. But I would place the wind, particularly offshore turbine, is, I would call it engineering marvel. You need a skilled manpower. We produce roughly 1 million technical graduates every year. So we are going to take the challenge to give the manpower to the rest of the world.
Great. That's a great addition to the motivations there again. And while you were mentioning the status of the pre-construction activities, I was just looking at Markus, and then I just have a question for you as to, are you excited by what Mr. Balaraman says? Does it give you more confidence to invest?
So in order to invest and to assess the studies that need to be done for such an investment, you always need to balance how detailed do the studies need to be before you can actually go to a tender. So we're very grateful for the wind data that we have received and are factoring that into our planning. A big chunk of the CapEx estimation will ultimately come from what's happening below the service. And for that, I understand there's 3 boreholes that have been drilled in a relatively close area, but they're not covering the whole area. So we have a first idea, and we would be able to put a bid together on that idea. But what happens if you have preliminary studies? The bid needs to cover certain risk aspects that are associated with studies that will then be done by the developer at a later stage. And that's something where we're very happy to engage with NIVE and also with MNRE to discuss what additional studies are required in order for the developers or IPPs to be able to submit the most aggressive bids. Because that's for us clear. India is a market that is very price competitive. And we want to make sure that we give recommendations on how we can get the price of offshore wind down already from the first project as much as possible, incorporating the lessons learned without copy-pasting basically, but incorporating the lessons learned we have made in Europe, also for the Indian market, adapting them to start on a relatively low cost level. Because if we're using up too much of the viability gap funding and we're not quickly able to compete with other technologies in the market, then offshore wind will not develop fast enough. And therefore, we want to make sure that from the start, we get it right.
Right. You brought out so many different nuances to that. And I have a very simple question, actually. What more are you looking from the government to basically, like what kind of subsidy support or other incentives are you looking for to basically say, yeah, we are ready to build the first projects?
Well, we're typically there for simplicity. So you could talk about many different subsidies, cutting the import tax for the turbines and PLFs for the supplier. But effectively, what you want in an auction environment, you want one item to bid on. So from our idea, it would make a lot of sense for India to fix a tariff that can be 3.5 rupees per kilowatt hour, and then have the developers bid on the viability gap funding and make sure that thereby the viability gap funding that is utilized for these projects comes out to be as low as possible. So that is, for example, one request.
I think that's a rather simple ask. Okay, moving along. Niels, can the existing onshore wind supply chain that we have in India be tapped to meet the needs of the offshore wind in the country?
It probably can in the long run, but as I just heard, I can only second that we need simplicity to get started. So if the expectation is that the first offshore wind turbine is made in India, then I think it's a tall ask. We also have the challenge, of course, that a lot of the onshore infrastructure, the factories, have been built close to where the offshore turbines are installed. Not necessarily next to a big port that can accommodate more than 100-meter long blade or a nacelle that weighs 400 or 500 tons. So while the skill sets and the basic manufacturing capabilities definitely can be reused, in many cases we'll probably find they're in the wrong part of the country.
Okay, and I see, Bernhard, you were making some notes. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think what I can only again underline what Niels said. If we look into the onshore setup in the blade factories across in India, and where the offshore potential sites are, that needs different setup. Yeah? I think it's clear if we talk about 100-meter blades, 400 tons to be manned, you do it at the harbor. Yeah? Because the logistics cost or logistic challenges you can't overcome in the country. Yeah? And I think that is clear. I'm more about concerned of the pre-work done for the big offshores. So we know how a factory looks like to be built for 1 gigawatt. We know where the ship's coming from, at least the first ship. Yeah, but the whole pre-work, what also Markus is saying, you were saying, needs to be done, because that lowers the risk, or somebody else has to cover the risk. Yeah, that's more my concern, or my not concern, an item to fix, and that can take long.
Right. So at this point, I actually have a question for everyone here as to, are we really expecting the first turbines to be made in India or designed for India? Just a quick response from everyone. I think Markus saying no. Mr. Balaraman?
See, if you want to kickstart the offshore activity, I'm just talking about Indian context, but if you're talking about Asia Pacific region, so we need to start working on what is the lessons learned in the onshore segment. Till 2015, we used to have the same type of turbine coming to India for onshore, but post the auction mechanism what have been introduced, we could see a lot of models of India-specific models coming in. So unless that's going to happen, so I'm not just talking about, other motivation, again, I forgot that to mention. If you want to look into Asia-Pacific region, India is the hub. So in that context, we are trying to talk about the test center and the research center. We are trying to talk about Dhanushkodi, where it's going to throw a lot of insights. So if I try to talk about, at the end of the day, the VGFs to be lowered, as rightly pointed out by my friends here, and also we are trying to talk about the LCOE need to be lower. If you are talking about that particular one, the European turbines would not give, because the technology part of it, I definitely take murder, it's not an issue. But question is going to be, we are going to give very clearly the target and the vision to them. That's the kind of vision we are giving at the 30 gigawatts. And also we are trying to talk about, yes, but beyond 30 gigawatts, you can also give the pathway for Asia Pacific region through India. So definitely, please bring in the turbine, which is going to bring down the lower LCOE in the offshore segment.
Right. I think I'll just stop taking more responses for this question just in the interest of time. But yeah, moving along now, and this is probably a billion-dollar question. The scale of the industry is such. Mr. Dash, what is actually the status of the first offshore wind tender, and when can the industry expect it to come out?
So as expected, you see, I cannot give a definite answer, which with all due respect, I know all stakeholders wants a definite answer for this question, but unfortunately, I don't have a definite answer. But I can say that our concept note for the required viable gap funding has already been sent to Ministry of Finance, who are waiting for a response from them. So as soon as we receive a response from them, if it is approved, by this year end, definitely we are coming up with a tender for that 1 gigawatt. So this definite answer for that December 2022, if I may say it, is subject to approval of that VGF. So that is, you know, something which you may not like it. But rest of the things, as Dr. Balaraman sir has already pointed out, for Gujarat project, the preliminary activities has been completed. And we already have those tender documents, and all other contractual documents are right now under preparation. So except that VGF funding, everything is ready. But that VGF funding is the main thing. Without that also, this project will not take off. So that is a fact. So that is how that is becoming our, so I can say the day we get that approval, we can go for tender.
I guess we need someone from Ministry of Finance here in the room as well. But yeah, moving along. Actually, Markus, coming back to you. In the absence of the interest from the distribution companies, power distribution companies in India, do you think there's a market for offshore wind from, say, the corporate consumers, or even, say, taking the risk of going merchant in the offshore space in India?
So what you typically see for global markets where offshore wind has developed, that they typically didn't develop straight away with a PPA market. You had a certain arrangement by the government that was supporting the offtake of the projects. In India, this could be via the discoms, basically, covered with state support in that regard. And then thereafter, the industry and the private companies might get together. The topic in India is not yet a very far developed PPA market, also when it comes to other technologies. So offshore being significantly larger scale and higher investment is less likely to be leading on the PPA market in that regard. So I do expect the first projects will certainly be via that discom route supported by the government.
Okay. And actually now going back to our virtual guest, Mr. Alastair, what do you think are actually the main things that the government should be actually taking care of in the offshore wind tenders? How can actually the government provide a boost for the offshore wind industries? Like which areas are the most important ones?
Thank you. So some of this has already been mentioned, and certainly the viability gap finance will unlock a lot of things. Then the first tenders, there's a Model 1 and a Model 2 proposed. The industry is more used to the Model 2, but it can work with both of them. The piece of the puzzle that's missing in the Model 2, as I understand it, is that any developer that wins a competition doesn't get exclusive rights for development, which is what happens in every other market. So they can put the tens of millions of dollars of investment into surveys and doing the development to get to a really keen price for the second stage of the tender. So the discussion paper was very good. It covers a lot of topics, but I think critical is the award of seabed rights for the first phase in Model 2.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
In fact, our discussion paper actually covers, as I appreciate that, it is appreciated by the industry. We have, in fact, tried to address all these concerns. Let it be pipeline, let it be common infra, let it be the clearance procedure, and what kind of VGF funding and what kind of strategy. I mean, how do we start? Like you have pointed out, it should be 5, 5, 5. So that is how also we have made that strategy that 3 gigawatt initial financial support will be there. And after successful completion of that 3 gigawatt only, we will try to come up with the fiscal incentives to scale it up to 30 gigawatt. So all these things are addressed, but one thing, that exclusivity for those people who are investing on study survey, that was missing on that paper. And we have received actually inputs from 2-3 stakeholders on that discussion paper subsequent to Honorable Minister's discussion. And we have already put forward those proposals to Honorable Minister. Once we get a signal, in fact, we are looking into it. And we'll very soon come up with the response to that.
Excellent. That's really good to hear. Thank you.
Great. And I think I actually have a different kind of a question. So we heard about the industry asking what they expect from the government. Actually, I now want to know from you, Mr. Das, as to what exactly do you want from the industry to actually kickstart the construction activities?
Now, in fact, what I want, in fact, I'm getting slowly from the industry. We really wanted industry to make that fast move, or I will not say fast move, at least the move along with us. We are definitely striving in our ministry to make offshore a reality, and now I can see that the industry also, coming up with their share of responsibility, and they're ready to go, explore those waters. I mean, investing on studies and surveys. So this is what we have expected from them, and we would like them to engage with us and give us the informations, realistic informations from worldwide, or what would be the Indian specific thing. And secondly, most important thing what I would like to say is, the fast mover in the Indian market will definitely have an edge in the tender process, because it is a highly price competitive market. So the scope of reducing the price will only come when they understand the dynamics of this market, and they should understand how much localization they can do and how cost benefit they will get out of those localizations. So if they move, I mean, they should explore this market quicker, it is better for them.
Okay, that's brilliantly said, sir.
To what Prabir is talking about is, again, today the visibility of what kind of a turbine technology we are trying to bring in the low wind and the moderate wind regime. Of course, GE is talking about to come out the ultra low wind speed turbines. But when you're talking about the determining what LCOE is going to come up, unless we have the critical information. So this one area, we are definitely looking from the OEMs. What kind of a turbine you want to bring into the Indian market? At least give us some kind of indication, not necessarily you're going for the thing, at least a design evaluations and other things, so that can give a very clear input for us to come out, okay, this is the kind of LCOE. Otherwise, if you try to talk about the same power curve of the turbine outside European, if you try to do it here, it is going to be very low numbers in the CEF, and very LCOE is going to be higher. So definitely this is the one area need to be worked on. We need to start working.
Okay, that's interesting as well. And I actually have a related question for you. But before that, I have an announcement for the audience. Actually, you can also ask questions to the panelists. We may take up a couple of them. So yeah, if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I think someone from the organizing team will reach you. But before that, Mr. Balaraman, and this is something which we have kind of like touched upon during the course of discussion, but have you missed out on some things is something I want to kind of like understand from you as to how actually do you address the biggest question mark around costs for developing offshore wind in India? What more could be done, or what is something that is not being looked at by the OEMs and the IPPs right now?
See, again, rather than talking about what they are missing out, first thing is there are many works that have been done in the silently. We are trying to work the many aspects to de-risk part of it, and we are trying to talk about the infrastructures and the port part of it. There's a study separate is going on. These are the things that are being done parallelly, and every aspect we are trying to do it to address to the OEMs. And now coming from that side, we need to be very clear. Okay, what exactly the additional information you need for the fast forwarding on the offshore journey. Okay, and very critical again, I want emphasizing the fact here. Okay, the technology part of it and the financing needs part of it need to be very explicit, so that these are the numbers is going to come out some kind of things for us to calculate and present before the top people, so that you have to get a fast tracking on the approval process.
Okay. Bernhard, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking here, and
Did I catch you in a spot?
yeah, because I think there is a big expectation from both sides. Yeah, and I think seeing the success of offshore in other countries, you all sometimes forgot what does that need. Yeah, you see a success, you hear the stories, but what behind is not always seen and is present. Yeah, so if I remember setting up the Burbo Banks 25 megawatt, yeah, was a different enemy than Greater Gabbard, and the following now when Jens is setting up in Asia, Niels is setting up in Asia plants, totally different. So we should not underestimate on one hand, yeah, on the other hand, be motivated to do it. And a tender 1 gigawatt is always very attractive. Yeah, and we are hearing fast movers and so on. But we have to balance that with the risk we're taking or with stakeholders taking, like Markus' company or others. So I'm still, having looked at the offshore now the last 5 years, a little bit more intensive in India, as a side remark to our onshore business, yeah, it needs to bring, or we need to bring together really on an let's say cooperative approach, the stakeholders together.
The cooperative approach.
The corporate. You can't start again in a game or this journey in this high commercial environment. I can tell you, you will fail. You need competition, but the start needs on really same eyes level, yeah, and then you pick and then you run. But don't expect or don't make the mistake, I can say, apply these commercial rules for the first 100 megawatts. Yeah, Markus said it, a support mechanism needs to be there. Yeah, because when we talk about 25 years, 30 years lifetime of the project, that's big investments.
Right.
So cooperation is very important.
Cooperative federalism
Yeah.
of some sorts.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we just have a couple of minutes. Yeah, I'm curious if you have an audience question. I think there's one right at the front. Please introduce yourself and ask the question.
Ramesh from the Business Line newspaper. A couple of very quick questions. Now, how feasible, how sensible is it to integrate solar with offshore? And you have a 1 gigawatt offshore. Can you bung in 200 megawatts of solar? That's one question. Secondly, sir.
We'll just take one. Sorry, we are really out of time. And Bernhard, do you want to take?
Yeah, look at the capacity factors or PLFs of solar and wind. Then you find the answer. Don't mix it.
Markus, do you want to add something to it?
I would just add, I agree fully with Bernhard. I would add a different perspective, maybe why it doesn't make sense. The first offshore wind project in India will be crucial. It will be a lighthouse project that the rest of the industry is built upon. So the strong ask is, don't overcomplicate it. Why throwing in a solar project into the first offshore wind project that will only add complexity and potentially delay the first project? If we want to achieve the 30 gigawatts, we need to focus on offshore wind, and we need to only focus on offshore wind.
Right. With that, I think we've
and because I see your reaction and the reaction here on the solar side in the audience, I'm not saying that you don't do solar, because solar is very successful, but don't make it complicated. I can imagine the motivator or boost factor for offshore will be green fuel. Because think about, we in offshore we talk about gigawatts connected, 2 connection lines to shore, combined with a green fuel big size. That's the big booster, but not in the first phase. It will come and create more potential.
Got it.
One more quick question, very quick
No, I
question.
think we have actually run out of time. And I just actually want to give the last word to Mr. Niels, and yeah, actually, if you have to just highlight, say, one key takeaway for the audience from the session, Mr. Niels, what would that be?
Yeah, I think if you look at, there are many countries in Asia that is trying to start offshore wind. And I would really encourage India to look at what has worked really well out here. And I have to say, I'm probably sitting in the country that has had the steepest ramp and the biggest build out in the region. So Taiwan, within 5 years, will have 5 gigawatts in the water. And that is by the time where other countries will just get started. So what we have seen is a clear government policy, making it easy to get started, subsidies in the beginning, and then gradually declining into a more competitive market, and then scale. You know, the 2 gigawatts in the beginning is nice, but if we have a 10 gigawatt plan, it is much easier for the industry to get in on that track and get the cost down fast.
That's actually an excellent way to put it up. And I think I was supposed to close it with some sort of conclusion. I think Mr. Niels concluded it very well for me. So I think that's it for the session, and back to the organizers.
So thank you to all our speakers for giving those deeper insights into India going into the deep waters. But yes, as you mentioned, don't go alone. Take the experience and the expertise of the more established markets and chalk out your own pathways. And yes, the tender also coming by the end of this year, hopefully with the Ministry of Finance nod. Thank you for those insights. May I request Anish to kindly present the mementos to our speakers. Sorry, Atin. Yeah. Thank you to Mr. Telgmann. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Dash. Thank you once again, Mr. Balaraman. Thank you to Mr. Markus Kösters. And appreciation of thanks by Mr. Devigiri to Mr. Atin Jain, our moderator. Also thanking our virtual speakers, Mr. Neil Steenberg and Mr. Alastair Dutton. Excellent session we had. If we can have a group photograph with all of you. Mr. Dash, a group photograph? Because I feel close.